everyone, and welcome back to another video. So today's video is going to be a tag. I saw this tag on Sam from Thoughts on Tomes channel, and I thought it was going to be a lot of fun, and I am definitely a fantasy reader, so I thought I would do the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader tag. So I believe Sam said that originally this tag was a Get to Know the Romance Reader tag, which was created by Bree on the blog Falling for Romance. I will leave a link to that blog down below. There are 10 questions in this tag, so let's get into it. Question number 1 is, what is your fantasy origin? Basically, how you came by the first fantasy book that you read. So I don't know necessarily what the first one I read was, since I've always been a reader, and I've always, I think, really enjoyed fantasy novels. But I will say that there was one series that really got me into epic fantasy and high fantasy, and that series was the Books of Pelennor series by Alison Croghan. So the first one is The Naming, and it was a book that my mom actually found for me. We were in Borders, rest in peace, and she found this one on the shelf, and she's like, Cass, I think this is something that you might really enjoy. So I read the back of it, and I totally agreed, so I ended up buying it, and I loved it. It is actually one of my favorite book series of all time. I know a lot of people have not read it, and I think it's very underrated. So this is a young adult fantasy series that is pretty reminiscent of Lord of the Rings in the sense of the kind of world building, but it's not as dry as what Lord of the Rings is, even though I love Lord of the Rings, don't get me wrong. But I do really love this series. It is one of my favorites. It definitely holds a special place in my heart, and it is something that really got me into fantasy that I read nowadays. So it may not have been the first one that I read, but it was one that made me who I am. Question number 2 is, if you could be the hero or heroine in a fantasy world, what tropes would you want in that world, and who would you want to write it? So I did a lot of thinking, and I thought that I would really like to be that kind of lost princess turned badass, like maybe assassin or something. I think that would be a lot of fun. I'm kind of writing that story now. I think that I would like either Brandon Sanderson to write it, because he has amazing world building and his magic systems are just top notch, or Sarah J. Maas. Only because I need a good man in my fantasy series, and if I'm gonna be the protagonist, I need a good man, and Sarah J. Maas can write those men. So question number 3 is, what is a fantasy series or book that you read this year that you want other people to read? And for that one, I ended up choosing The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. So this is an ARC version. I haven't actually got my finished copy quite yet. I read this as an ARC, and I just completely fell in love with it, and I think a lot of people will really enjoy this. There's things for everybody in this book. There's a lot of action, there's a touch of romance, there are diverse characters, diverse sexualities, and I just loved it. Loved it. So I think a lot of people would really enjoy this, and I believe it came out earlier this year. Yes, earlier this year. And I think a lot more people should pick it up, because it was a wild ride and a lot of fun. Question number 4 is, what is your favorite fantasy subgenre, as well as one that you would want to read more of? So I actually had to look up the subgenres of fantasy, because I didn't know them off the top of my head. I just kind of include them all in fantasy. But I would say that my favorite subgenre is dark fantasy, a la Ninth House. It's like very dark. Dark fantasy and like high fantasy for sure. Sword and sorcery fantasy is another one too, because that's like a lot of action, and I love magic. Really good magic systems, so those as well. But one that I would want to read more of would be urban fantasy. I don't read a lot of that, and I think it's because when I think of fantasy, I think of like Lord of the Rings worlds, like newly created, and not my world with magic, if you know what I mean. I would also like to read more romance fantasy. I love romance. I love it. it's fabulous, especially if it's in a fantasy. So if you have any of those recommendations for me, let me know down below, because I need more. Number 5 is, who are some auto-buy authors for you? That would be like Naomi Novik, Leigh Bardugo, Sarah J. Maas, just to name a few. And all women, so that's fabulous. Number 6 is, how do you typically find fantasy recommendations? I usually find mine on YouTube as well as Twitter. Twitter gets me a lot of good information. Sometimes it's a lot of drama too, but Twitter does give me some good recommendations. And I follow a lot of booktubers, so on YouTube too. Number 7 is, what is an upcoming fantasy that you're excited about? This one, I have 2 answers. One would be Memory of Souls by Jen Lyons. This is the 3rd book in her... I don't know what the series is called. The first one is Ruin of Kings, which was one of my favorite books of last year that I read. The second one is The Name of All Things, which I have an art copy, and I haven't read it yet. But hear me out, guys. I'm going to read it soon, and I know I'm going to love it. So that means that the 3rd one is going to be something I'm really excited about too. So that one is coming out, I believe, at the end of this year, something like that. So I am excited for that one. I'm also excited for The Empire of the Vampire by Jake Kristoff. So this one, I don't think it has a cover yet. It is actually releasing next year, at the end of next year. So September of 2021. At least that's what Goodreads says. I do not know for sure, but I read the synopsis, and guys, it sounds insane and so good. So it is about a world where the sun has not risen in 24 years, so it's perpetually dark, and creatures of the night, vampires, have pretty much ravaged the world. And I believe this book is following a guy named Gabriel, who is the last of his kind, which is, I think, some sort of family, maybe like vampire hunter. Don't really know for sure, but he is charged with telling his story, and I think this book is his story, and he's telling his adventure with finding this person named Yor, who I think has the ability to find this chalice or something. I'm not explaining this well at all, but this like chalice cup thing is prophesized to bring the end of this like perpetual darkness, but I believe like that cup was destroyed as well as the person who could do that. So he's telling the story, and we don't know how this darkness is going to end. So I did not explain that right at all, probably, but it sounds really good, and you guys should look it up on Goodreads because it sounds great. Number 8 is, what is one misconception about fantasy that you would like to lay to rest? So for this, I would say that not only men write fantasy. Women can too, and women write it well, most of the time. A lot of the time. I also get a lot of, you're not a real reader if you're reading fantasy, and people say that a lot about YA as well. Like, you're not a reader if you're not reading the classics or things like that. You are a reader no matter what you read. Okay, you're a reader if you're reading a magazine. You're a reader if you're reading a newspaper. As long as you're taking in, like, literature and information, you are a reader. So it doesn't matter what genre you're reading. Fantasy or, you know, the classics, like Pride and Prejudice. I love Pride and Prejudice. I do. They're not, like, either or. You can read anything you want and still be a reader. So that is definitely like a major thing that I kind of get frustrated about, because I feel like people look down on me because I'm not reading like a lot of nonfiction books or, you know, a lot of classics, even though I do like a select few. But fantasy is a genre that I like aim for, and that's the genre that I want to read. So it makes me happy. So I think a lot of people just get that wrong, and I just want to clear that up. Everybody's a reader, no matter what they read. Number 9 is, if someone has never read a fantasy book before, what are 3 recommendations that you would give them? So for this, it really depends on the type of person or the type of reader. I can't just like say a book and think that everybody's going to really enjoy it, but I do have a couple that I think are good introductions and I think would work for a lot of people. One of them would be The Unspoken Name that I mentioned before. This one also has a few sci-fi elements, so it is a good introduction to sci-fi as well. So I would say that one, as well as The Girl in the Stars by Mark Lawrence. Both of these actually I read this year, so they've been pretty recent. Their magic systems and worlds are not convoluted. They're actually pretty easy to understand, and I think that's where a lot of people struggle when getting into fantasy, because there are some epic fantasies that the world building and the magic systems are just so like extreme and intense that it's really hard to grasp, especially if you're new to the genre. So those two books are definitely ones that are pretty easy to understand, as well as being very enjoyable. So definitely those two. And the final question, number 10, is who is the most recent fantasy reading content creator that you have been watching? And for this one, I don't think I have any recents that I found. A lot of the recent people that I've subscribed to are ones that read just pretty much anything and everything. They're not just like fantasy geared, but I did mention Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. I do follow her, and I've been following her for a very long time, and she's one that I would recommend watching if you are not subscribed to her already. She is absolutely fabulous. I love all of her book recommendations as well as her reviews that she does. She does a lot of gripes and gushes as well as spoiler-free reviews, so I really enjoy those. And she reads a lot of fantasy. So there you have it, everyone. That was the Get to Know the Fantasy Reader book tag. If you are a fantasy reader, please do this tag, or let me know some of the answers to these questions down below. I would love to know them. Please like this video and subscribe if you aren't already, and I will see you all next time. Bye!